The auction grounds at Tuli Creek smelled the way all frontier auction grounds smell in August, of horse sweat and dried manure, and the particular sharp anxiety of men who have come to spend money they cannot entirely afford to spend. The sun had been up for 4 hours, and it was already performing the kind of violence on the back of your neck that makes you understand why old-timers in this country wear their collars buttoned regardless of the heat. They'd learned. I hadn't yet. I was there for the Railroad Survey Company. My job was to assess property values along the proposed Cimarron Spur. Land, livestock, infrastructure, the human architecture of economic possibility. I had a leather satchel, 3 pencils, a pocket watch, and the deep private suspicion that none of my numbers would ever mean anything to anyone who actually lived out here. The Cutter farm sat at a bend in the Cimarron River where the water ran brown and low in summer, and the cottonwoods grew close enough together that you could stand in their shade at midday and almost forget that the world outside them was trying to cook you alive. I'd ridden past it twice on my survey runs. 80 acres, a stone and timber house that leaned slightly north as if making a polite inquiry of the weather, 2 stone outbuildings, a stock pen that had seen better livestock, and a kitchen garden that was fighting the drought with a stubbornness I found admirable. Elias Cutter himself I had not yet met when I arrived at Tuli Creek that morning. I knew him only from county records. Elias James Cutter, age 43, widower, single dependent listed as Rosalind Cutter, age 14. Former debt obligations, 2, both satisfied. Current tax standing, current. Military service, none recorded. Land value assessment, marginal. The county clerk who'd handed me his file had said, without being asked, "Decent man, hard luck." Then she'd gone back to her stamps. I found a position near the east fence rail where I could see the ring and the crowd both. I've found in my years of watching men conduct commerce that the crowd is often the more revealing subject. The animals are what they are. It's the humans who are performing. There were perhaps 60 men gathered when the Rafferty girl, Leela, 17, who ran the numbers for her father during auction season with a precision that made several professional accountants of my acquaintance look like they were counting on their fingers, called the first lot. The first 8 animals moved through quickly. A pair of draft mules that went to a homesteader from up near the neutral strip. 3 young quarter horses that a gentleman from Dodge City acquired with the quiet efficiency of a man who does this regularly and finds it tedious. A gray gelding with a suspicious right hock that nobody wanted, then everybody wanted, then 3 people wanted simultaneously, and which sold eventually for more than it was worth to a man who bid with his hat and looked deeply satisfied with himself. I was writing notes, estimating, calculating the ratio of purchase prices to assessed values, doing the honest, necessary, bloodless work of economic observation. Then they brought her in. She was small. That's the first thing and the most important thing, and the thing the crowd decided everything from. She was small in the way that reads, to a certain kind of eye, as broken. Her coat was the color of old red brick with a dark mane that hadn't been properly brushed out in what looked like months, and she moved across the ring with a hitching, uncertain gait that made at least 4 men nearest me exhale through their noses in that particular way that means not worth my time. She was 3 years old. She had a scar running from her left shoulder blade down across her flank, the kind of scar you get from wire, the kind that heals wrong and leaves behind a topography of contracted tissue that never quite forgets the original injury. Her head was low, not in the alert, collected way of a well-trained horse, but in the dim, defeated way of an animal that has learned that lifting it doesn't tend to lead anywhere good. Leela Rafferty announced her as Lot 9. Dam unknown, sire unknown, provenance, bill hatches spread near the Beaver River sold as part of a state settlement. Starting price $1. The crowd reaction was not immediate. There was a beat, maybe 3 seconds, during which the number processed through 60 pairs of ears and arrived at 60 pairs of minds, and then there was laughter. Not mean exactly, but certain. The kind of certainty I described at the beginning, the specific human music of a group of people who have collectively decided that something is not worth taking seriously. "Dollar well spent," somebody said from behind me, more laughter. "Is she dead or just planning on it?" This from a man 3 spots to my left who was wearing a town suit in 100-degree heat, and had the red, aggrieved face of a man who resents everything in his immediate vicinity. I wrote Lot 9, filly approx. 3 undetermined breeding, physical condition poor, asking $1. Crowd response, derisive, my assessment. I stopped. I hadn't formed an assessment yet. That bothered me. I was paid to form assessments. I watched the filly walk the ring, and I noticed something. The hitching gait, it wasn't uniform. On the straightaways, when she wasn't turning, when the ring hand wasn't applying the directing pressure of the lead rope, she moved differently. Not well. Not in any way that would have attracted a buyer's eye in that crowd. But differently, there was something in the extension of her right foreleg, a kind of reaching that didn't match the rest of her defeated body language, like a musician who keeps time correctly even while sick, some structural memory operating independently of current conditions. I was still staring at that foreleg when Elias Cutter raised his hand. He was standing perhaps 12 feet to my right, and I hadn't noticed him until that moment, which tells you something about the kind of man he was. Not invisible, but still. The kind of stillness that doesn't call attention to itself. He was lean in the way of men who work outdoors and don't eat surplus, wearing a collarless shirt washed to the color of old sky, canvas work trousers, boots that had been resoled twice, and had a long life ahead of them regardless. His hat was flat-brimmed, sweat-stained, functional. His face was the kind of face that takes 43 years of weather and difficulty, and converts it not into hardness exactly, but into a kind of careful attention, as if every feature has learned to notice things precisely, because the cost of missing things has historically been high. He raised his hand and said quietly, "$1." Leila Rafferty looked up from her book. $1, thank you, Mr. Cutter. Do we have any advance?" Silence, then the man in the town suit laughed again. "Let him have her," he said to the men around him. "Save us all the trouble of watching her drop in the heat." Nobody else bid. "Sold," said Leila Rafferty. $1 to Mr. Cutter." The laughter wasn't mean, it was certain. I wrote Cutter paid $1 for Lot 9. He was the only bidder. There was laughter. He did not appear to hear it or did not appear to care, which may be the same thing. I introduced myself to him at the water trough on the north side of the grounds, where he was letting the filly drink. She was taking long, steady pulls, and he was standing at her shoulder with his hand flat against her neck, not stroking, not reassuring in any demonstrative way, just present. A sustained contact that said I am here without requiring her to respond to it. "Elias Cutter," I said. He looked up. His eyes were a very light brown, almost amber, the kind of color that seems to collect light rather than reflect it. "That's right." I introduced myself, gave him my employer, my purpose, the standard explanation of the survey and its relation to property assessment. He listened without interrupting, which in my experience is rarer than it should be. "You're writing down what things are worth," he said when I finished. "In a general sense, yes." "What did you write down for her?" He didn't look at me when he asked it. He was watching the filly drink. I paused. I was honest with people I assessed, almost by professional principle. It was the only way the numbers meant anything. "I didn't complete the assessment." "Why not?" I wasn't sure what I was looking at. He looked at me then, that amber gaze doing its collecting thing. "Good," he said after a moment. "Most people are." I asked him, and I am aware this was not within my professional remit, but I was 26 and curious, and the journal was waiting, why he'd bought her. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "My daughter named her already." "Beg pardon." "Rosie, she's been watching the auction list for a month. Wrote to Leila Rafferty, asked her to send advance notice of any young fillies in the lots." A brief something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe. "She's 14. She has opinions about things. Your daughter named a horse she'd never seen. She named her the night she got the auction list. Rosie." He looked back at the filly, who had finished drinking and was now standing with her nose slightly elevated, nostrils working at something in the middle distance. "Said any horse selling for $1 deserved a name before she got there." I wrote that down later, almost verbatim. I have the page still. I rode out to the Cutter farm 3 days later, professionally obligated. My assessment form required a livestock inventory update. The filly's purchase represented a change in assessed property value, marginal, but recorded. Rosalind Cutter met me at the gate. She was 14 in the way that some 14-year-olds are, not childlike, not adult, but inhabiting some narrow territory between the two with a kind of forceful competence that made you feel you should apologize for underestimating her. She had her father's amber eyes and her late mother's dark hair, according to the county record's single photograph, and she was wearing a canvas work apron over a calico dress and holding a curry brush in her right hand with the matter-of-fact ownership of someone mid-task. "You're the survey man," she said. It wasn't a question. "James Aldrich, yes." "Papa said you might come." She stepped back from the gate. "Rosie's in the near pen. I just finished her coat." I tied my horse at the post and followed her. The near pen was the smaller of the two stone-walled enclosures, and the filly was standing at its center with a changed quality of presence that it took me a moment to identify. She was still small. The scar was still visible. Her build was still the kind of build that reads, at first glance, as unremarkable. But her head was up. Not in alarm, in attention. Her ears were pricked forward, and her nostrils were working in that deliberate, curious way that means an animal is choosing to engage with its environment rather than endure it. Rosie, named before she arrived. Given by this 14-year-old girl with her curry brush and her amber eyes, the thing that the auction crowd had never thought to offer. "She eats," Rosalind said matter-of-factly. "Papa was worried she wouldn't. But she ate this morning." She looked at the filly with the kind of expression that is careful not to be too much of anything. 14 years old, and already she'd learned to hold hope at arm's length. "She's going to be all right." It was not a question, it was a declaration, the kind that precedes the work required to make it true. I wrote down my livestock assessment numbers. Change in inventory, one filly, poor condition, estimated value marginal. Then I closed the book and watched Rosalind Cutter go back into the pen and begin brushing the filly's neck with the steady, patient strokes of someone who has decided that this particular thing is worth the effort, regardless of what the crowd thinks. Elias Cutter found me on the way back to my horse. He'd been mending the north fence. I could see the wire and post tools still laid out along the line, and he walked toward me with the gait of a man who has been crouching for 3 hours and is not going to let it show. He asked what I'd assessed the farm at. I told him. Marginal productivity, acceptable infrastructure condition, land value consistent with surrounding parcels at current cattle market prices. He nodded. "That's what I thought." "The filly won't change the assessment materially," I said. "I'm sorry." "I know." He stopped a few feet from me. In the distance, Rosalind was still brushing. "That's not why I bought her." I knew that. I'd known it since the water trough. I asked anyway. "Why then, precisely?" He looked at his daughter, at the filly standing still under her hands. "My wife died 14 months ago," he said, 3 days before Rosie's 13th birthday. A pause, not the dramatic kind, the kind where a person is selecting words with the care of someone who has learned that incorrect ones cost more than silence. "She was the one who kept things bright, if you understand me. I kept things running. She kept them bright." Another pause. "I'm not good at bright." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Dollar horse," he said. "Dollar horse, and my girl wrote her name in a letter before she ever laid eyes on her." He looked at me, the amber eyes doing their collecting. "You tell me what that's worth." I could not. My ledger had no column for it. He went back to his fence. I rode back toward Tuli Creek with my professional assessments, and my numbers, and my very incomplete understanding of what I had witnessed. That night in my rented room above the Tuli Creek Mercantile, I opened my journal and wrote for an hour without stopping. I wrote about the way the crowd had laughed. I wrote about the hitching gait and the reaching foreleg. I wrote about a 14-year-old girl who named horses before she met them. I wrote about a man who kept things running for a woman who kept them bright, and who was trying, in the only way his nature knew, to approximate brightness for a daughter who needed it. Then I wrote, "I think the filly is going to surprise everyone. I cannot explain why I think this. I cannot fit it into an assessment form. I am putting it here instead." I closed the book. The prairie outside my window was doing its summer nighttime performance of wind and cricket sound, and the occasional distant howl of something that had its own opinions about the darkness. I lay on my narrow, rented bed and thought about what it means to see something in an animal that an entire crowd has looked at and dismissed. I thought about it for a long time. I did not return to the Cutter farm for 8 months. The railroad survey consumed the fall and most of the winter, long, cold rides across the stripped grassland. Nights in frontier boarding houses that varied from bleak to actively hostile, endless rows of numbers that I transcribed into master ledgers, and sent east on the weekly mail coach to men, I had never met who would convert them into investment decisions that would reshape the lives of people like Elias Cutter in ways those people would not be consulted about. I thought about the farm periodically, casually the way you think about a book you left half-read, aware of it, not urgently so. I thought more often about Rosalind Cutter with her curry brush than I did about the filly. That posture of held hope, that declaration, she's going to be all right. I hope she was right, I would think sometimes, in drafty boarding house rooms with the wind working the window frame. Then I'd go back to my numbers. Spring came early to the Cimarron Basin in '88. The kind of early that feels like an apology for the previous winter, the cottonwoods going green in the first week of March, and the river running higher than it had in 4 years. I was back in the territory on a follow-up assessment tour, and my route took me within 5 miles of the farm. I extended the route. Professionally, I told myself, changed property conditions require reassessment. It was not a complete lie. Elias Cutter was in the east field when I arrived, and he raised a hand in greeting that contained neither surprise nor particular warmth. A rancher's acknowledgement, "You exist," I noted, "now we can proceed to business." I had come to appreciate that quality in the 8 months since I'd met him. It was a form of honesty. "Aldrich," he said. Cutter, passing through, thought I'd update the assessment. He looked at me with the amber eyes and the careful attention, and he didn't say what we both understood, which was that nothing on a marginal 80-acre farm in the Cimarron Basin changes materially in 8 months and requires professional reassessment. "Come up to the house," he said instead. The house, the lean toward the north that I remembered, the kitchen garden, which had survived the winter under a mulch of straw and was now producing the first tentative spears of spring onion. A pair of new hens in the side yard, pecking the ground with the focused, business-like energy of professional excavators. And in the near pen, when we came around the corner of the stone outbuilding, the filly. I stopped walking. 8 months, the scar was still there. It would always be there. The dark mane had been brushed and braided and rebraided so many times that it had a particular texture now, a memory of consistent care. She was heavier through the shoulder, her barrel rounder, her hindquarters filled out in a way that the gaunt, defeated animal of the Tuli Creek auction had given no indication of. But it was the way she moved that stopped me. She was circling the pen at a working trot, not asked to, not directed, just doing it, and the hitching gait was gone. Not partially gone. Gone. Replaced by something that I am going to attempt to describe accurately, because I was 27 years old and not experienced in horses, and I want to be honest about what I actually saw rather than what I retrospectively knew I was seeing. She moved like water finding level, like something operating according to a law of physics so fundamental it requires no effort. Her legs tracked up perfectly, her back swung through with a fluency that made the fence rails seem to vibrate slightly in sympathy. When she turned, when she reached the far corner and wheeled and came back, she balanced through it with a lightness that I have no adequate vocabulary for. I said intelligently, "Oh." "Yes," said Elias Cutter. "What happened to the—" "Wire scar did something to the muscle. When she's cold, it still catches. Rosie walks her out for 40 minutes every morning before she does anything else." A pause. "Before school, she gets up in the dark." I looked at him. "Every morning." 8 months, he said. "Every day, she doesn't tell me she does it. I see the lamp go out her window at 5. Something moved in his face, that ghost of a smile thing I'd seen at the water trough. "She doesn't do it for me to see." I looked back at the filly, at the way she moved. "She's fast?" I asked. It was a stupid question, and I knew it when I asked it, but the alternative was silence, and I wasn't ready for silence yet. Elias Cutter looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know yet. I know she's something." Rosalind was home by the time we reached the house. School let at 3 in the spring. The local school teacher had a farm of her own and let the children out early for planting season. She was at the kitchen table with a notebook, working through what appeared to be arithmetic problems, and she looked up when we came in with her father's expression on her face. "You exist, I note it, we can proceed." She was 15 now, and the 8 months had done something to her that months do to 15-year-olds, which is simply to make them more themselves. The held quality I'd noticed in her before had deepened. Not hardened, that's not the right word. Clarified, like a solution that is settled. "Mr. Aldrich," she said. "Miss Cutter, your father was showing me the filly." "Rosie," she said, A small correction delivered without edge, simply factual. She has a name. Rosie, I sat when Elias gestured to the chair across from her. She's extraordinary. Rosalind looked at her arithmetic, back at me. I know, she said, and went back to her arithmetic, not arrogantly, with the quiet certainty of a person reporting on something they'd verified through sustained observation. I know, as in, this is established information. The discussion of its establishment is not particularly interesting. What comes next is interesting. I asked Elias, while Rosalind worked and the coffee pot heated on the iron stove, what he planned for the horse. He poured coffee, strong, dark, the frontier standard, and sat across from me at the table and said, I've been talking to a man named Declan Walsh. He runs the September race at Fort Supply. I knew the Fort Supply race. Most people in the territory did. It ran in the third week of September, attracted horses from across 3 territories, paid a purse that was significant enough to matter and small enough that only the genuinely competitive bothered attending. You're thinking of entering her? I said. I'm thinking about it. You don't know her speed. No. She's never raced. No. I looked at Rosalind, who was not looking at us, who was writing numbers in her notebook with a pencil that needed sharpening and didn't show any sign of participating in this conversation, and who I was absolutely certain was listening to every word. People will think, I stopped. People already thought, Elias said. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. Large hands, a working man's hands, with the particular roughness at the pad of the thumb that comes from consistent rain work. At Tuli Creek. I said nothing. That already happened, he said. Can't happen for the first time again. I looked at him. I thought about the way certainty sounds coming out of a crowd. The way it expels from 60 sets of lungs simultaneously. The way it sounds different from cruelty. And the way that difference, when you are on the receiving end, might be entirely irrelevant. I thought about a man who kept things running for a woman who kept them bright, and who was learning, in the second year of grief, to approximate brightness in the only ways he knew how. What does she eat? I said. What does she need? A pause, then, why? I didn't have a good professional answer. I didn't have a good personal one either. I had a 27-year-old's answer, which is to say I had a feeling that I hadn't finished figuring out and an instinct to follow it into whatever came next. I have a survey office in Dodge City, I said. I pass through the territory every 2 months. If you need anything, I stopped. The horse, if she needs anything. Elias Cutter looked at me with the amber eyes. A long look, the collecting kind. Good corn, he said finally. Good corn and regular work and someone who doesn't expect anything from her except what she is. He looked at his coffee. That's mostly what anything needs. I came back in June. I came back in August. Both times professionally obligated, both times extending the route past the point that professional obligation strictly required. I watched Rosalind work the filly in the mornings. I say work, she would laugh at the word. She moved Rosie through the fields east of the farm with a loose-rein communication that was less instruction than conversation. 2 beings who had developed, over 8 months of pre-dawn lamplight and patient walking, a vocabulary of weight and breath and micro-shifts of balance. The filly responded to her the way a well-tuned instrument responds to a musician who knows it, with precision and something that, if you were being rigorously honest, you would not call emotion, but that you also could not comfortably call the absence of emotion. I watched Elias Cutter at the fence rail, watching his daughter. He had the stillness of a man performing an act of private reverence, not looking at the horse, looking at Rosalind, at the particular quality of her attention when she worked, at the brightness she'd somehow generated in herself, the brightness he'd said he wasn't good at. I wrote he didn't produce the brightness. He bought a $1 horse and stood back and watched his daughter produce it herself. I wonder if he knows he's done something extraordinary. Then I wrote, I wonder if extraordinary is always this quiet. I was in Fort Supply on the 2nd Friday of September. The race was Saturday. I had a professional reason to be there, assessment work in the supply area, livestock and infrastructure. I had also written a letter to Elias Cutter 6 weeks earlier to say that if the assessment kept me in the territory through the 3rd week of September, I might happen to be in the area. He had written back in handwriting that was spare and functional with no ornament, Rosie runs Saturday. Come if you can. I came. The race grounds at Fort Supply were a straightforward affair. A quarter-mile track beaten into the prairie east of the fort, a starting rope held by two men of enormous patience, a finish line marked with whitewash on a cedar post. The crowd numbered perhaps 200. Vendors, ranch hands with their best horses and their spring wages or their fall assessment money, which amounts to the same thing. A betting operation running out of a wagon with a canvas side flap that served simultaneously as odds display and rain shelter. 7 horses were entered. The favorites were immediately apparent to anyone who knew horses, which I was learning I didn't, but which the crowd around me obviously did. A gray thoroughbred out of a Dodge City operation, owned by a man named Ferdinand Oakes who wore his money in the way certain men do, not ostentatiously, but completely, so that it appears to be a natural property of the person rather than an accumulation. A big bay gelding from the Cherokee Strip, wide through the chest, with the aggressive alertness of a horse that has won before and knows what the gathering of a crowd means. 2 or 3 others I noted with varying degrees of attention. And then there was Rosie. I heard the crowd's response before I saw her come around the corner of the staging area. A particular quality of laughter, that certain sound, and I felt something tighten in my chest that I didn't have a technical term for. She was still small. She would always be small. In a lineup with the gray thoroughbred, she looked like the kind of horse you send someone out to buy more horse with. Her scar caught the morning light from a particular angle, and the man standing next to me said, to no one in particular, "Did that one get lost on the way to the plow line?" Rosalind Cutter was on her back. She rode the way she worked the filly in the morning fields, loose-reined, upright, with the quality of attention that isn't concentration exactly, but something more fundamental, something closer to listening. She was 15 years old in a calico dress with a flat-brimmed hat that matched her father's, and she sat Rosie with a centeredness that several of the male riders in the lineup were notably lacking. Elias Cutter was at the fence rail. He had his hat in his hands. I had never seen him without the hat, and the absence of it, the quality of exposure it represented, said something about the morning that I felt in my sternum without being able to articulate. I went and stood beside him. He didn't look at me. Aldrich. Cutter. A pause, the starting line organizing itself. The crowd finding its viewing positions. The particular compressed quality of the air before something is about to happen that cannot be undone. "Good corn and regular work," he said very quietly to the fence rail. I said nothing. "And someone who doesn't expect anything except what she is," he said. The rope came up. I will tell you this, I did not know in the first 3 strides what I was watching. The gray thoroughbred went to the front immediately, which is what thoroughbreds do. They understand what starting means. The big bay gelding went second. The field organized itself along predictable lines, and Rosie was in the middle of it, and I thought with a sinking that I tried not to feel, it isn't going to be enough. It takes a particular combination of circumstances, I have since learned, to make a horse what Rosie was. You need the bones first, the structure that no amount of wire scar or starvation can entirely erase. You need the engine, the particular cardiovascular design that is genetic and ancient and cannot be trained into a horse any more than you can train a man to be 6 feet tall. You need the mind, the quality that Rosalind had seen and named before she'd ever laid eyes on it. The quality that makes a horse in its 3rd stride begin to understand that this is the thing it was built for. And you need someone who spent 8 months getting up in the dark. At the midpoint, she was 4th. At the 3/4 mark, she was 2nd. The crowd noise had changed by then, not yet the full roar of a crowd that knows what it's seeing, but that transitional sound, the confused excitement of people revising their certainty in real time, the cognitive friction of a belief meeting its contradiction. I heard the man who'd made the plow line joke say something I couldn't make out. I heard Ferdinand Oakes shout something at his gray. At the last 40 yards, Rosie ran. I don't have better words than that. She ran. Not faster than before faster, but a different order of running, a gear that she'd been holding in reserve through some instinct or training or private decision. And she came up on the gray thoroughbred with a quality of inevitability that made the crowd go silent for perhaps 2 full seconds before it erupted. She won by a length and a half. Elias Cutter's hands had his hat. He'd been turning it in his hands throughout the race, the way I fidget with a pencil, the way everyone has their thing they do when the moment is too large for stillness. When she crossed the line, his hands stopped. He didn't shout, he didn't raise his fist. He stood at the fence rail with his hat in his still hands, and his face doing something I had no precedent for, not in the county records, not in the property assessments, not in anything I had been professionally trained to observe and quantify. I wrote it down afterward in my journal as best I could. He looked like a man who has been carrying something for a very long time in the dark, and has finally stepped into light sufficient to see what he's been carrying, and the seeing of it is not triumph. It's something older and quieter and more complete than triumph. It's the look of a debt being paid to someone who can no longer receive it. I still believe that's as close as I could get. The purse from the Fort Supply race was $90. I know that number with precision because I was there when Leela Rafferty's father, Ben Rafferty, who ran the betting operation from his canvas-sided wagon, counted it out into Elias Cutter's palm in the late afternoon sun, while the crowd dispersed around them, and the horses were being walked out, and Rosalind Cutter sat on the fence rail and ate a piece of hardtack with the focused contentment of someone who has earned their food. $90 was not millionaire money. It was not even farm-saving money, not by itself. It was 2 months' wage for a skilled laborer, or a new plow, or a winter's worth of decent corn and hay, or the first installment of something larger. Elias Cutter folded the bills with the same careful hands that had turned his hat throughout the race and put them in his shirt pocket, and said to Ben Rafferty, "Thank you." Then he went to find his daughter. I went to find a pen. What happened in the 3 years following the Fort Supply race, I can tell you in approximate detail, because I was in the territory for the survey work through the spring of 1890, and the Cutter name had become the kind of name that survey men and county clerks and traveling salesmen mention to each other in the way of people sharing information they want credit for having known first. Rosie ran 7 races between September of 1888 and October of 1890. She won 5 of them outright. She placed second in one by a margin that caused the owner of the winning horse to walk over to Elias Cutter after and ask, very quietly, whether the filly was for sale. Elias said no. He said no to several people over those 3 years. He said it with the same quality of stillness he'd said everything, the same quality of attention that didn't require volume or aggression to communicate absolute finality. He said no to Ferdinand Oakes, who came twice. He said no to a man from a Kansas City racing operation who arrived with a lawyer and a figure that Ben Rafferty, who told me about it later, described as enough to make a saint reconsider. Elias said no. He said no because Rosalind was 17 by then, and 18, and she was managing the training operation with a precision that had attracted attention from people who knew what precision in horse training looked like. She had a notebook, a series of notebooks, actually thick ones with cloth covers, in which she recorded Rosie's morning times, her diet variations, her response to different track conditions, her gait measurements before and after the daily walking routine. She had developed, through 3 years of pre-dawn lamplight and patient observation, a training methodology that was not written down anywhere else, that she had arrived at through the empirical discipline of someone who cannot afford to be wrong. I saw the notebooks once. Elias showed them to me in the summer of 1890, the last time my survey route took me through the territory. He put them on the kitchen table and said, simply, "Look at these." And I looked at them, and I understood something that I hadn't understood before about the difference between what people see and what things are. She had measured everything, every variable, not in the academic style of someone who has been taught to measure things, but in the practical style of someone who measures because the information is necessary for decisions that matter. Her handwriting was her father's handwriting, spare, functional, no ornament, but the contents were something I had never seen in any property assessment or railroad survey document. They were the record of an intelligence that had encountered a problem worthy of itself and had given itself to the problem completely. She was 18 years old. She had been doing this since she was 14 in the dark before school. I wrote, "I have been measuring things for money my whole professional life. I have never measured anything with this quality of attention. I am not sure I know what this quality of attention requires or whether I have it. I suspect I do not." The change in the Cutter farm's economic situation happened gradually, then not gradually at all. The stud fees began in 1890, when Rosalind, with Elias' legal signature on the paperwork, because she was not yet 21, negotiated a breeding arrangement with a horse operation out of Wichita. Rosie was 5 years old at the theoretical end of her racing years, and Rosalind had been thinking about what came next since she was 16. She had written letters. She had ridden 50 miles to Dodge City to meet with a man who knew bloodlines. She had spent months corresponding with breeding operations in 3 states. The arrangement she negotiated was not the standard arrangement. I read a copy of it later. It appeared in a county filing I came across in the course of a Dodge City assessment in the spring of 1892. And it was the document of someone who had done everything except be formally educated in the subject. Which is to say, it was the document of someone who understood the subject more completely than most people who had been formally educated in it. She had identified, through her 3 years of tracking Rosie's performance variables, what was exceptional about the filly's bloodline. She had traced backward, through auction records, estate inventories, old race sheets, to identify the probable sire of Rosie's dam. She had, through this process, established that Rosie was carrying a bloodline that had been considered played out, been abandoned by the operations that had originally developed it, and had survived in scattered and unrecognized form through the kind of accident that looks like degradation from the outside. The arrangement paid the Cutter farm a stud fee that the county clerk, not the original one. She'd retired. Her successor was a young man from Oklahoma who told me about this with the specific excitement of someone who'd witnessed something that contradicted their expectations, described to me as considerable. The first year of stud fees paid off the remaining farm debt. The second year funded a new horse barn, stone construction, the kind that planned for the long term. The third year, 1893, Rosalind Cutter, 20 years old, unmarried with her series of cloth-covered notebooks and her father's amber eyes, and the particular quality of attention that cannot be taught and will not be argued with, founded the Cowboy Creek breeding operation on a 160-acre land claim that she'd filed with the Territorial Land Office in her own name, because she was 20 now, and the paperwork required no one else's signature. I left the territory in the fall of 1891. The Railroad Survey Company transferred me east, Chicago, where the work was larger, and the pay better, and the boarding houses had indoor plumbing, and I lost, gradually, the callus on my right hand from rain work and the particular ability to sleep through wind. I kept the journal. All of them. I was on my 7th by then. I thought about the Cutters periodically in the Chicago years. More than periodically. In the way you think about something that changed how you see things, which is to say you don't always notice you're thinking about it, but it's altered the angle at which everything else arrives. I thought about the auction crowd, the sound of certainty, the way it expels from lungs. I thought about 14-year-old Rosalind Cutter naming a horse she hadn't met yet, because she decided that any horse selling for $1 deserved a name before she got there. I thought about good corn and regular work, and not expecting anything except what something is. I received a letter from Elias Cutter in the spring of 1895. It was 2 pages in the spare, functional handwriting, and it said the following things. That the Cowboy Creek breeding operation was now in its 2nd year of full operation, with 20 mares and 3 proven sires, and that Rosalind was running it with the assistance of 2 employees, both experienced, both hired on Rosalind's assessment rather than his. That the farm had been expanded to 240 acres, that the stone house had been repaired, the north lean corrected, the foundation repointed, the roof replaced. That a man from Louisville had come the previous fall to look at the breeding operation and had left with a contract and a conviction, as reported to Elias by Rosalind, who had a talent for reporting other people's reactions with the flat precision of a scientific observer, that he had never seen anything like it. That Rosie was 11 years old and was doing well, and that Rosalind still walked her out in the mornings. At the bottom of the 2nd page, in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest, slightly more effortful, like a man transcribing words he'd been saving, was this. My wife used to say that some things look like nothing until they look like everything, and the interval is just time, and time is just patience with a different name. I thought you'd want to know that I think she was right. I read that paragraph 4 times, then I opened my journal and wrote it down. I went back in the summer of 1897, 11 years after the Tuli Creek auction. I was 37 by then, which is not old but feels old when you have spent 11 years doing indoor work in a city that has made you aware of the precise dimensions of your professional life. I had a different employer. I had a better satchel. I had 12 journals with cloth covers, which was an accidental echo I noticed only when I arrived at the Cutter Creek breeding operation and saw Rosalind Cutter, 24 years old, lean and brown from outdoor work, with her father's amber eyes and a calm authority that filled whatever space she entered without trying to, carrying a notebook with a cloth cover to a meeting with 2 buyers from Lexington, Kentucky. She looked at me across the yard and said, "Mr. Aldrich." "Miss Cutter." "Rosalind," she said, the same small correction 11 years later, delivered without edge, factual. The operation was everything the letter had described, and also not adequately described, because letters lack the physical dimension of 240 acres of well-managed land, of stone buildings that had been built for the long term and were being used accordingly, of 20 mares with their coats right and their attention alert, and their condition reflecting years of careful, patient, measured management. Of the breeding records, Rosalind's notebooks had multiplied into a filing system that occupied 2 full shelves in the operations office. That represented a decade of accumulated observation, converted into systematic knowledge. Of the money, I was a surveyor. I dealt in property values. I can tell you that the assessed value of the Cutter Creek breeding operation in the summer of 1897 was substantially above the threshold that, in the territory's parlance, constituted substantial wealth. Not eastern seaboard wealth, not railroad magnate wealth, but the kind of wealth that means no debt, no fear of weather, no calculating whether you can afford to keep the lamp burning, no terrible arithmetic of marginal farms. The kind that takes something that's sold for $1 and turns it, over a decade of getting up in the dark, into something that cannot be accurately priced. Elias was in the near pen when I found him. He was 53 by then, the 11 years on his face and the way outdoor years accumulate, in depth rather than damage. He had Rosie's halter rope in his hand, and Rosie, 14 years old, white starting to show at her muzzle, her scar still there, still silvery in certain light, was standing at his shoulder with her nose slightly elevated. Working the air, the way she'd done at the Tuli Creek water trough the first morning 11 years ago. He turned when he heard me come through the gate, the amber eyes, the still quality. "Aldrich," he said. "Cutter," I stopped. "She looks well." "She does." He looked at the filly, at Rosie, 14 years old and white at the muzzle and still with her head up. "Rosalind won't race her anymore, says she's earned it." "What does she do?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pen. Rosie's ears pricked toward something in the north. "Whatever she wants," he said. I stood there. The sun was doing its August work. In the distance, the Lexington buyers' horses were being walked in from their trailer by one of Rosalind's employees. Somewhere past the stone barn, I could hear Rosalind's voice, clear and level, explaining something technical to someone who was being paid to listen. I opened my journal, old habit. I had the pen out before I was consciously aware of reaching for it. "You're going to write that down?" Elias said, not a question. "Yes." He watched Rosie work her nostrils at whatever she was reading in the north wind. "What are you going to write?" I thought about it, about the dollar and the laugh, about the pre-dawn lamp, about 14-year-old Rosalind writing a name in a letter, about good corn and regular work, about a man with his hat in his still hands at a fence rail in September of 1888, about the sound of certainty meeting its contradiction. "I don't know yet," I said. He nodded. He'd expected that answer, or its equivalent. He understood about not knowing yet, about the interval between looking like nothing and looking like everything. He turned back to Rosie. I put the pen to the page. The wind came through. The mares in the east field moved together, slowly, the way animals do when they are comfortable and the weather is bearable, and there is no particular urgency to the moment. The afternoon light came down at the angle it reaches in late August, long and amber and deliberate, taking its time with everything it touched. I wrote for a while without stopping. When I looked up, Elias Cutter was still at Rosie's shoulder, his hand flat against her neck the way it had been at the Tuli Creek water trough. Still, present, not asking anything of her except what she was. She was still working the wind, still finding something in the north, still, at 14 years old, with her silver scar and her white muzzle, keeping her head up. The buyers from Lexington came through the gate. Rosalind followed them, notebook in hand, and she caught my eye across the distance and gave the smallest nod, acknowledgement, recognition. The note that a thing has been seen by someone who was there at the beginning. I looked back at my page. Good corn and regular work, I wrote. And someone who doesn't expect anything except what she is. That's mostly what anything needs. That's mostly what anyone needs. I stopped. The sentence that came after it I didn't write. I've thought about it many times in the years since the exact words, the precise formulation. I've never been able to get it right. The interval isn't finished. I'm still in it. Some things look like nothing until they look like everything. I keep the journals, all 23 of them now. I haven't found the last sentence yet. I think I'm still looking.